In the winter of 1903, a Serbian colonel named Dragutin Dimitrijević gathered 28 army officers in a Belgrade apartment to plan a murder. Their target was their own king and his queen. By dawn on June 11th, the royal couple lay dead, their bodies thrown from a second-floor window of the palace. Serbia had just switched dynasties through assassination. The Obrenović line, allied to Austria-Hungary, was extinct. The Karađorđević dynasty, tied to Russia, took power. This was not just a palace coup. It was a geopolitical earthquake. Serbia's violent pivot from Vienna to St. Petersburg created a new flashpoint in the Balkans that would detonate 11 years later when another group of Serbian conspirators, led by the same Dragutin Dimitrijević, assassinated an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo. 1903 was the year the fuses were lit. In East Asia, Japan and Russia broke off negotiations over Korea and Manchuria. Each side knew war was coming. They were just choosing the battlefield. In Macedonia, Christian rebels proclaimed independence from Ottoman rule and were crushed with such brutality that Austria-Hungary and Russia imposed foreign control over 3 Ottoman provinces. In Panama, a French engineer orchestrated a revolution backed by American warships, creating a new nation in 3 days so the United States could build a canal. Every conflict that erupted in 1903 was a detonator for a larger explosion. The Russo-Japanese War would inspire Asian nationalism and trigger the Russian Revolution of 1905. The international intervention in Macedonia would become the template for great power meddling that turned the Balkans into the powder keg of Europe. The Panama Canal would transform America into a 2-ocean naval power capable of global projection. Even the year's technical innovations carried military implications. On December 17th, 2 bicycle mechanics flew 120 feet over North Carolina sand dunes. No one understood yet that they had just added a third dimension to warfare. The Meku, as Serbians call it, began with grievances that seemed purely domestic. King Alexander had married Draga Mašin, a widow 12 years his senior with a scandalous past. The army hated her. The public despised her. When rumors spread that the childless queen's brother would be named heir to the throne, the officer corps had enough. But the conspiracy went deeper than court gossip. The real issue was geopolitics. Since 1889, Serbia had been economically dependent on Austria-Hungary. Serbian pork and plums went north. Austrian manufactured goods came south. This trade relationship was also a political straitjacket. The Obrenović dynasty understood that defying Vienna meant economic strangulation. King Alexander had tried to maintain this balance while modernizing Serbia's army with French weapons and Russian training missions. But every step toward independence triggered Austrian retaliation, higher tariffs, blocked loans, and diplomatic isolation. By 1903, Serbia was trapped between submission and bankruptcy. The conspirators saw only one escape: kill the Austrian client king and align with Russia. Just after midnight on June 11th, 28 conspirators, all army officers, burst into the royal palace. They had keys provided by the queen's enemies at court. They knew the palace layout. What they didn't know was where the royal couple was hiding. For 2 hours, they searched room by room, shooting guards and servants who resisted. Finally, they found King Alexander and Queen Draga crouched in a secret compartment behind a bedroom wardrobe. The officers dragged them out and opened fire with revolvers. Then they hacked at the bodies with sabers. Then they threw the mutilated corpses from a window into the courtyard below. Along with the royal couple, the conspirators murdered the prime minister, the war minister, and the queen's 2 brothers. They wanted no Obrenović loyalists left alive. Within hours, the Serbian parliament proclaimed Peter Karađorđević as king. The 59-year exile had been living in Geneva, translating John Stuart Mill into Serbian and waiting for his chance. The conspirators had contacted him months earlier. He knew what they planned. He neither endorsed nor prevented it. Peter's accession meant Serbia's realignment. Where the Obrenovics had looked to Vienna, the Karageorgievics looked to St. Petersburg. Where Alexander had sought accommodation with Austria, Peter would seek confrontation. The new dynasty's legitimacy rested on nationalism, the dream of uniting all South Slavs in a greater Serbia, even those living under Habsburg rule. Austria-Hungary watched in horror as its client state transformed into its mortal enemy. Russia celebrated as a new Slavic ally emerged on Austria's southern border. The Belgrade conspirators had succeeded beyond their intentions. They hadn't just changed a dynasty, they had shifted the balance of power in the Balkans. Captain Dragutin Dimitrievich, who fired the first shots at the royal couple, would later found a secret organization called the Black Hand. 11 years later, the Black Hand would provide the weapons for Gavrilo Princip to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. While Serbia changed dynasties through assassination, Macedonia tried to change empires through insurrection. On August 2nd, St. Elijah's Day, Eilanden in Slavic, the internal Macedonian revolutionary organization, launched a general uprising against Ottoman rule. The rebels knew they could not win militarily. Their strategy was to provoke Ottoman atrocities that would force European intervention. They succeeded in the provocation. They failed in everything else. The uprising began with coordinated attacks on Ottoman garrisons across 3 provinces. In the mountain town of Kruševo, 800 rebels overwhelmed the Turkish garrison and proclaimed the Kruševo Republic, complete with a provisional government and a manifesto promising equality for all ethnicities and religions. It was the first attempt at a multi-ethnic democracy in the Balkans. It lasted 10 days. When Ottoman reinforcements arrived with artillery, Kruševo's defenders had only hunting rifles and farm tools. The rebels' leader, a socialist schoolteacher named Nikola Karev, had believed that proclaiming a republic based on ethnic equality would win European sympathy. Instead, the great powers watched as Ottoman troops systematically destroyed the town. They burned the churches, looted the shops, and executed suspected rebels. The Republic's ministers fled into the mountains or died fighting in the streets. Across Macedonia, the Ottoman response followed a brutal logic: collective punishment. If a village supported rebels, burn the village. If a district rose in revolt, depopulate the district. By October, the uprising was crushed. The internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization's own records counted the cost: 4,694 rebels killed, 12,000 civilians massacred, 70,000 refugees fled to Bulgaria, 30,000 houses burned, 200 villages destroyed. The Ottoman military had restored order through arithmetic, calculating that systematic terror was cheaper than prolonged counterinsurgency. They were right. But their mathematics created a different problem: European public opinion. Photographs of burned churches and refugee columns reached European newspapers. The same publics that had ignored Macedonia's complex ethnic politics suddenly demanded action against Turkish atrocities. Even emperors who preferred Ottoman stability to Balkan chaos had to respond. On October 2nd, Tsar Nicholas II and Emperor Franz Joseph met at a hunting lodge in Mürzsteg, Austria. These two autocrats, whose empires would fight to mutual destruction in World War I, agreed to cooperate in Macedonia. They would impose reforms on the Ottoman Empire, not to help Macedonians, but to prevent each other from exploiting the crisis. The Mürzsteg Agreement divided Macedonia into 5 sectors, each supervised by a different great power. Austrian officers would reform the police in one district, Russian officers in another, British in a third, French in a fourth, and Italian in a fifth. This was not liberation. It was international occupation disguised as humanitarian intervention. The Ottomans accepted because rejection meant war with all of Europe. The Macedonian rebels rejected it because the reforms preserved Ottoman sovereignty. But what rebels wanted no longer mattered. The great powers had taken control. The Mürzsteg system created something new and dangerous: a European precedent for intervening in Ottoman territories under humanitarian pretexts. Every subsequent Balkan crisis, Bosnia in 1908, the Balkan Wars in 1912 to 1913, and ultimately Sarajevo in 1914, would invoke the Merzsteg model of great power intervention. While the Balkans erupted in violence, a quieter but deadlier confrontation was reaching its climax in East Asia. Since August, Japan and Russia had been negotiating over Korea and Manchuria. By December, both sides knew diplomacy had failed. The negotiations had never been genuine. They were each side's attempt to buy time while preparing for war. Japan's proposal was simple: Russia keeps Manchuria, Japan takes Korea. From Tokyo's perspective, this was reasonable. Korea was vital for Japanese security, a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan if controlled by a hostile power. Russia already had Manchuria with its warm water port at Port Arthur. Why not accept the division? Russia's counterproposal revealed the impossibility of compromise. Japan could have influence in southern Korea only, must not fortify it, and must recognize Manchuria as outside Japan's sphere entirely. From St. Petersburg's perspective, this too was reasonable. Russia had invested millions in the Trans-Siberian Railway and the Chinese Eastern Railway. Port Arthur was the prize of Russian expansion. Why should Japan dictate terms? Each side's reasonable position was an existential threat to the other. On December 21st, Japan's cabinet met for 4 hours to make the final decision. The debate was not whether to fight, but when. Finance Minister Sonne Arasuke laid out the numbers. Japan could sustain a war for 18 months before bankruptcy. Army Minister Terauchi Masatake reported that every month of delay meant 7,000 more Russian troops in Manchuria via the incomplete Trans-Siberian Railway. Navy Minister Yamamoto Gonohayo confirmed the fleet was ready, but warned that Russia's Baltic fleet could arrive in 8 months if deployed. The strategic window was closing. Russia grew stronger every day the Trans-Siberian Railway extended. Japan grew weaker every day, its finances drained on military preparations. War in February 1904 offered possible victory. War in February 1905 meant certain defeat. The cabinet voted unanimously for war. Both sides viewed the coming conflict through racial lenses that would shape the 20th century. Russian commanders spoke openly of the Yellow Peril, the need to stop Asian expansion before it threatened European civilization. Tsar Nicholas referred to the Japanese as macaques in official correspondence. Japan's leaders understood they were fighting not just Russia, but the entire assumption of white superiority that justified European imperialism in Asia. Victory would prove that Asian modernization could match European power. Defeat would confirm that the white empires were invincible. This racial framing would make the war's outcome revolutionary. When Japan won in 1905, colored peoples across the colonized world, from India to Egypt to Vietnam, would see proof that European empires could be beaten. Filipe Buno Varela was not a diplomat. He was not a soldier. He was not even Panamanian. He was a French engineer with shares in a bankrupt canal company, and in November 1903, he created a new nation to protect his investment. The French Panama Canal Company had collapsed in 1889, leaving behind rusting machinery and $40 million in theoretical assets. Bunau Varela owned shares in the successor company that held the concession. If the United States built a canal through Nicaragua, the original plan, his shares would be worthless. If it built through Panama, the United States would have to buy the French assets. In August 1903, Colombia's Senate rejected the treaty that would have given America the Canal Zone. They wanted more money. Bunau Varela saw his fortune evaporating, but he had studied history. He knew how America had created Texas in 1836 and Hawaii in 1893 by supporting local independence movements that requested American protection. Panama could be next. Bunau Varela met with Manuel Amador, a Panamanian doctor involved in the independence movement, in a New York hotel room. He wrote a check for $100,000, promised that American warships would prevent Colombian troops from crushing the revolt, and had himself appointed Panama's representative to negotiate with Washington. On November 3rd, Panama declared independence. The revolution consisted of bribing the Colombian garrison to stand aside while the municipal council voted for separation. The only violence was one Chinese shopkeeper killed by a stray shell and a donkey hit by shrapnel. On November 6th, the United States recognized Panama, the fastest recognition in American diplomatic history. On November 18th, before any actual Panamanian could reach Washington, Bunau Varela signed a treaty giving the United States a 10-mile wide zone in perpetuity with all the rights, power, and authority which the United States would possess if it were sovereign. Bunau Varela had given away more than any Colombian negotiator had ever contemplated. The Canal Zone would bisect Panama, dividing it in half. The United States would control the zone as sovereign territory, with its own laws, courts, police, and customs. Panama would receive $10 million up front and $250,000 annually, less than Colombia had rejected. When Panama's actual delegation arrived in Washington, they discovered their country had already been sold. Bunau Varela presented them with the fait accompli: accept the treaty or face Colombian reconquest without American protection. They had no choice. Theodore Roosevelt would later boast, "I took the Canal Zone." More accurately, Bunau Varela took it and gave it to Roosevelt. A French engineer's investment portfolio had redrawn the map of the Americas. In December 1903, Colonel Diven Ulskers, Francis Young Husband, crossed into Tibet with 1,000 soldiers, 7,000 porters, and 4,000 yaks. His mission, according to London, was to negotiate a trade agreement. His actual purpose was to prevent Russia from establishing influence in the world's highest strategic ground. British intelligence had reported Russian advisors in Lhasa, Russian arms shipments to Tibetan monasteries, and a secret treaty between the Tsar and the Dalai Lama. None of it was true. The Russian advisor was a Siberian Buddhist monk offering religious teachings. The arms shipments did not exist. The secret treaty was a paranoid fantasy, but Lord Curzon, India's viceroy, believed in the Russian threat because he needed to believe. The Great Game, the Anglo-Russian competition for Central Asian dominance, justified his existence. If Russia was not threatening India's northern frontier, what was the point of the Indian Army's enormous budget? Young Husband shared Curzon's paranoia. When the Tibetans refused to negotiate at the border, he interpreted it as proof of Russian influence. When they insisted foreigners were not allowed in Tibet, he saw it as concealing Russian presence. Every Tibetan attempt to avoid conflict became evidence of conspiracy. On March 31, 1904, Young Husband's force encountered 3,000 Tibetan soldiers at Guru Pass. The Tibetans were armed with matchlock muskets, technology the British Army had not used for 2 centuries, and swords. Many were monks who believed the Dalai Lama's blessing made them bulletproof. Young Husband demanded they disperse. The Tibetans linked arms and began walking forward, chanting prayers. The British opened fire with Maxim guns and Lee Enfield rifles. In 4 minutes, 700 Tibetans were dead. The British suffered 12 wounded. A British officer wrote afterward that he was so sickened by the slaughter that he ceased fire, though the general's order was to make as big a bag as possible. By August 1904, Young Husband had fought his way to Lhasa. The Dalai Lama had fled to Mongolia. The British found no Russians, no modern weapons, no evidence of any threat to India. They found a medieval kingdom that wanted only isolation. Young Husband forced Tibetan officials to sign a treaty opening trade relations and paying an indemnity that would take 40 years to discharge. Then he experienced what he called a mystical revelation, a vision of universal brotherhood that made him realize the horror of what he had done. He would spend the rest of his life as a mystic and pacifist, haunted by the massacre at Guru. The invasion achieved nothing except demonstrating that British paranoia could project violence anywhere on Earth. Tibet had been no threat to anyone. Its violation proved that in the age of imperialism, even geographic isolation offered no protection from the great powers' anxieties. 3 organizational reforms in 1903 would determine how the great powers would fight their future wars. The Spanish-American War had exposed a fundamental problem. The United States Army was too small for imperial ambitions. Its state militias were too disorganized for modern warfare. The Militia Act of 1903, known as the Dick Act, after Congressman Charles Dick of Ohio, solved both problems by creating the National Guard. The federal government would fund, equip, and train the National Guard. In exchange, Guard units would adopt Army organization, meet Army standards, and be available for federal service. This was not just military reform. It was the creation of a reserve army that could be mobilized for overseas deployment. When America entered World War I in 1917, the National Guard would provide 40% of the American Expeditionary Force's combat divisions. The institutional framework created in 1903 would enable America to project 2 million men across the Atlantic in 18 months. By December 1903, Russia had 100,000 regular troops and 25,000 railway guards in Manchuria. This seemed impressive until staff officers calculated what it meant. These forces were scattered across a territory the size of France and Germany combined. They were supplied by a single-track railway that was not complete around Lake Baikal. They were defending ports and railways that absorbed most of their strength in garrison duty. Japan, by contrast, could land 150,000 troops in Korea within 2 weeks, with shorter supply lines and unified command. Russian reinforcements would take 6 weeks via the Trans-Siberian Railway if the line was not cut by Japanese raids. The mathematics of deployment meant Russia was weaker than it appeared. But Tsar Nicholas, reading reports in St. Petersburg, saw only the total numbers. He believed Russian strength would deter Japanese aggression. Instead, Russian weakness would invite it. The South African War had revealed chaos in British strategic planning. The Army and Navy did not coordinate. The Colonial Office and India Office pursued contradictory policies. No one could answer basic questions. Could Britain defend India and Egypt simultaneously? How many troops could the empire mobilize? Who decided strategic priorities? The Committee for Imperial Defense, established in 1903, was meant to answer these questions. Chaired by the Prime Minister, including the service chiefs and key ministers, it would coordinate imperial strategy. Its first major decision would come in 1904. It would support Japan against Russia to prevent Russian expansion while avoiding direct involvement. This committee would later decide that Britain must support France if Germany attacked, the strategic logic that would pull Britain into World War I. On December 17, 1903, Orville Wright flew 120 feet in 12 seconds over the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The longest flight that day lasted 59 seconds and covered 852 feet. 5 people witnessed humanity's entry into the age of flight. None of them were military officers. This was about to change. Within days of reading newspaper accounts, military theorists began calculating what aircraft meant for warfare. Reconnaissance was obvious. An airplane could see beyond hills and forests that concealed enemy movements. Artillery spotting was equally clear. Observers in aircraft could correct fire in real time. But some officers thought bigger. Captain Ferdinand Ferber of the French Army wrote in December 1903 that the airplane would make fortifications obsolete. Borders would become meaningless. The next war would be won by whoever controls the air. He was dismissed as a fantasist. 11 years later, German Zeppelins would bomb London. 15 years later, aircraft would strafe trenches on the Western Front. 37 years later, Strategic bombing would level cities. By late December 1903, the United States War Department, the British War Office, the French Ministry of War, and the German General Staff had all opened files on heavier-than-air flight. They began the same process, assigning engineers to study the Wright brothers' achievement, allocating funds for experiments, and considering specifications for military aircraft. The Wright brothers, still trying to perfect their control systems and secure patents, had no idea they had started an arms race. They thought they had built a vehicle for mail delivery and sport. Instead, they had added a third dimension to warfare that would eventually make surface navies vulnerable, armies naked to observation, and cities targetable from continents away. Every crisis of 1903 was a lit fuse burning toward future explosion. Serbia's violent change of dynasty created the nationalist tensions that would trigger World War I. The Macedonian uprising established the pattern of Balkan crises that would destabilize Europe. Japan's decision for war would humble Russia and inspire anti-colonial movements worldwide. Panama's engineered independence would create American naval supremacy. Tibet's invasion would push Britain toward accommodation with Russia. The Wright brothers' flight would revolutionize warfare within a generation. The leaders of 1903 thought they were solving immediate problems. The Serbian conspirators wanted a better king. The Macedonian rebels wanted freedom. The Japanese wanted security. The Americans wanted a canal. The British wanted to block Russia. The Wright brothers wanted to fly. None of them understood they were creating the conditions for the catastrophes of the 20th century. They were too focused on winning today's contest to see they were guaranteeing tomorrow's collision. 1903 proved that in an interconnected world, every local crisis had global consequences. Every tactical victory created strategic vulnerabilities. Every problem solved generated greater problems. The fuses lit in 1903 would burn for 11 more years. When they reached the powder in 1914, the explosion would destroy the world that created them.